At 38, I thought I understood what marriage meant. 10 years with the same woman, 10 years of shared bills and shared beds, 10 years of building what everyone around us saw as a stable, successful partnership. From the outside, we looked like we had it all figured out. 2 kids, steady jobs, a house in a decent neighborhood, annual vacations to places with decent hotels and mediocre restaurants. But inside that picture-perfect frame, something had been dying for years. It didn't happen overnight. Marriages don't usually collapse in dramatic explosions, they erode like coastlines, losing tiny pieces of themselves to each passing wave until one day you look up and realize the landscape has completely changed. We become experts at living parallel lives under the same roof, choreographing our days around each other without really connecting. The morning routine was a perfect example of this emotional distance. We'd wake up at different times, shower in different bathrooms, grab coffee from the same pot but drink it while scrolling through different phones, checking different news feeds, living in different digital worlds despite sitting 3 feet apart at the kitchen table. The kids would stumble downstairs, and we'd coordinate their schedules like business partners managing a small corporation. Who's picking up from soccer practice? Did you remember to sign the permission slip? Can you handle parent-teacher conferences this time? We'd become incredibly efficient roommates, executing the logistics of family life with the precision of a military operation. But when was the last time we'd laughed together about something genuinely funny? When had we last had a conversation that wasn't about schedules or responsibilities or problems that needed solving? The bedroom had become the most painful symbol of our disconnect. We'd lie there each night, our backs turned to each other, each pretending to be more tired than we actually were. Sex had become a monthly obligation at best, something we scheduled around everything else in our lives like a dental appointment. Even when we did come together physically, it felt mechanical, a brief release of tension rather than an expression of love or desire. I'd started staying up later, telling myself I needed to catch up on work emails or watch the news. Really, I was just avoiding the awkward dance of going to bed with someone who felt more like a stranger than a lover. She'd started going to bed earlier, claiming exhaustion but probably just wanting to be asleep before I came upstairs. We'd tried to address it. 2 years earlier, she'd surprised me by suggesting we explore polyamory. At first, I thought it was a joke, this woman who'd been increasingly distant and conservative in our relationship suddenly suggesting we open things up. But she was serious. She'd been reading about it online, talking to friends who'd tried it, convinced that maybe we just needed permission to find passion elsewhere since we couldn't seem to find it with each other. I was skeptical but willing to try anything that might save us. We set up dating profiles, established ground rules, had awkward conversations about boundaries and expectations. For a few weeks, there was actually some excitement in our relationship, not because we were dating other people, but because we were finally talking honestly about sex and desire and what we needed. But it fell apart quickly. She had a series of disappointing encounters with men who seemed more interested in adding a married woman to their collection than actually connecting with her as a person. Online dating in your 40s as a married woman apparently attracted every creep and commitment phobe within a 50-mile radius. She became bitter about the whole experiment, resentful that she'd opened herself up to that kind of rejection and disappointment. When she shut it down, I was almost relieved. The whole thing had felt forced, like we were trying to solve our intimacy problems by adding more people instead of figuring out why we couldn't connect with each other. But closing that door seemed to seal something between us. We'd acknowledged that our marriage was lacking passion, we'd tried an extreme solution, and when that failed, we just gave up. The marriage counseling started about 6 months before the affair. It was her idea, presented not as an opportunity to reconnect but as a last-ditch effort to see if we could salvage something worth saving. The therapist was a kind woman in her 60s who specialized in long-term marriages, and she immediately identified our core problem. We'd stopped seeing each other as individuals and started treating each other as roles in our shared life production. I was the husband, responsible for certain household tasks, expected to provide financial stability, supposed to fix things that broke and handle interactions with contractors and car mechanics. She was the wife, managing social calendars, organizing the kids' activities, maintaining relationships with extended family, keeping track of birthdays and anniversaries and all the emotional labor that keeps a family functioning. We were both competent in our roles, but we'd forgotten that underneath those titles were two people with their own dreams, fears, desires, and needs. When had I last asked her what she was thinking about when she stared out the window during her morning coffee? When had she last shown curiosity about my inner life beyond whether I'd remember to pick up milk on the way home? The therapy sessions felt like negotiations between two countries trying to establish trade agreements. We'd discuss communication strategies and conflict resolution techniques, but there was no spark, no sense that we were rediscovering why we'd fallen in love in the first place. It was maintenance therapy, focused on making our marriage functional rather than passionate. I started to feel like I was slowly disappearing. At work, I was respected as a site supervisor, someone whose opinions mattered, whose experience was valued. My guards looked to me for guidance and leadership. I had authority, responsibility, a sense of purpose. But at home, I felt invisible, interchangeable with any other reasonably competent man who could handle the assigned tasks of husbandhood. The loneliness was profound in a way that's hard to explain. I was surrounded by people who knew me, my wife, my kids, my coworkers, but I felt like none of them really saw me. I was just playing the part they expected, fulfilling the function they needed, but the real me, the person with hopes and dreams and desires of his own, had been buried under years of routine and responsibility. I didn't recognize how starved I was for genuine connection, for the feeling of being truly known and appreciated. I was like someone who'd been eating bland food for so long that I'd forgotten what it meant to taste something that actually excited my palate. I thought this emotional numbness was just what happened in long marriages, that the trade-off for stability and partnership was the gradual death of passion and excitement. I was completely unprepared for what was about to walk into my workplace and show me just how wrong I was. The security industry isn't exactly known for attracting the most dynamic personalities. Most of my guards were decent enough people, but they tended to be either young guys treating it as a temporary gig while they figured out their real careers, or older men who'd settled into the routine of spending 8 hours watching empty buildings and writing incident reports about suspicious squirrels. So when she walked into our facility for her first day of training, the change in atmosphere was immediately noticeable. She carried herself with a confidence that suggested she'd earned her place in the world through experience rather than luck. At 47, she had the kind of presence that made you straighten up a little, pay attention in a way you hadn't realized you'd stopped doing. As site supervisor, I'd trained dozens of new guards over the years. It was a routine I could handle in my sleep, show them the equipment, explain the protocols, walk them through the various scenarios they might encounter. Most trainees nodded along politely, asked a few basic questions, and spent their first week trying not to screw up anything too badly. She was different from the first handshake. Her grip was firm, her eye contact direct, and when I started explaining our procedures, she asked thoughtful questions that showed she was actually listening. Not just waiting for her turn to talk or trying to impress me with how much she already knew, but genuinely trying to understand not just what we did, but why we did it. During the mandatory mouth swab drug test, a routine procedure I'd overseen hundreds of times, something shifted. It was such a mundane moment, just another administrative requirement, but as I watched her complete the process with the same professionalism she brought to everything else, I felt a spark of attraction that caught me completely off guard. I buried it immediately. I was married, she was my subordinate, and I prided myself on maintaining professional boundaries. But the feeling lingered in a way that made me uncomfortable. I hadn't felt that kind of instant physical response to someone in years, maybe not since the early days with my wife when everything was new and exciting. The 3-week training period that followed became both a pleasure and a torture. We spent hours together each day, and I found myself looking forward to our sessions in a way that had nothing to do with work. She was incredibly easy to talk to, with a sharp sense of humor and a perspective on life that made even routine conversations feel engaging. We discovered we had an almost eerie amount in common. We'd both read the same obscure novels, shared similar taste in music that was probably too old for the younger guards to appreciate, and had parallel experiences dealing with corporate bureaucracy that could reduce competent adults to frustrated children. She told me about her teenagers, and I found myself sharing stories about my own kids that I hadn't thought about in years. But it was more than shared interests. She had this way of making me feel like what I said mattered, like my thoughts and opinions were genuinely interesting to her. When I explained security procedures, she didn't just nod and take notes, she asked follow-up questions that showed she was thinking about the bigger picture, about how each piece fit into the overall strategy. During coffee breaks, our conversations would drift beyond work. She told me about her decision to remain single, how she'd chosen to focus entirely on raising her children after a difficult divorce years earlier. There was something admirable about her sacrifice, the way she'd put her own romantic life on hold to be the parent her kids needed. But there was also something sad about it, this vibrant, intelligent woman who'd convinced herself that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. I found myself sharing more than I should have about my own life. Not specifics about my marriage problems, but general observations about the challenges of balancing work and family, the way responsibilities could sometimes feel overwhelming. She listened without judgment, offered insights that showed she understood the complexities of adult life without trying to fix everything or offer easy solutions. The physical attraction was always there, humming beneath the surface of our professional interactions. I'd catch myself noticing the way she moved, the sound of her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking about something. But I kept it locked down, convinced that I could handle a simple case of workplace attraction like the mature, married man I was supposed to be. What I didn't realize was that she was going through her own struggle with the connection we were building. Years later, she would tell me that from that very first day, during that routine drug test, she'd felt the same spark I'd experienced. That she'd gone home that night and found herself thinking about me in ways that shocked her, touching herself while imagining what it would be like to be with me, then feeling terrible guilt because she knew I was married. But at the time, she gave no indication that she saw me as anything other than her supervisor and trainer. She was professional, appropriate, friendly but not flirtatious. If she was struggling with attraction, she hid it better than I did. The training was going well, she was picking up everything quickly, showing initiative, fitting in well with the other guards. I started to think that maybe I'd found someone who could bring some much-needed energy and competence to our team. She seemed like the kind of person who would stick around, who might even be interested in advancing within the company. Which made it all the more devastating when corporate pulled the rug out from under all of us. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon, delivered with the casual cruelty that only corporate bureaucrats can manage. The company that had recently acquired US had decided to reduce redundancies, and they'd identified several positions that could be eliminated. Her previous employment record showed some absences that made her expendable in their cost-cutting calculations. Just like that, 3 weeks of training, of building professional relationships, of integrating someone into our team, was thrown away. She was professional about it, of course. Thanked me for the opportunity, said she understood it wasn't my decision, promised to keep in touch if other opportunities came up. But I could see the disappointment and frustration beneath her composed exterior. She'd needed this job, had been excited about the steady income and the possibility of building something stable. Now she was back to square one, looking for work in a market that wasn't particularly friendly to people in their 40s, especially women in male-dominated fields like security. I felt genuinely bad for her. Not just because she was a good worker who deserved better, but because I'd gotten used to having her around. The workplace felt duller without her energy, more routine without our daily conversations. I realized I'd been looking forward to seeing her each day in a way that probably should have been a warning sign. As she packed up her few personal items from the locker she'd been assigned, I made a decision that would change everything. I told her that she should feel free to stay in touch, that I maintained an open-door policy with former employees for references and job leads. It was something I'd said to dozens of people over the years, and usually nothing came of it. This time would be different. Her first text came about 2 weeks after she'd been let go. It was perfectly innocent, just checking in to see if I'd heard about any other security positions opening up in the area. I responded with equal professionalism, letting her know I'd keep an ear out and would definitely pass along any leads that seemed like a good fit. That should have been the end of it. A brief, professional exchange between a former supervisor and a worker who'd gotten a raw deal. But something about the interaction felt different. Maybe it was the timing. She'd texted me during a particularly frustrating day at work, and her message reminded me of how much more enjoyable the job had been when she was around. Or maybe it was just the fact that someone was reaching out to me as an individual rather than as a husband or father or supervisor with tasks to complete. I found myself responding with more than just job information. I asked how her search was going, whether she was having any luck with other companies, how her kids were handling the change in family income. She responded with updates that went beyond the purely professional, sharing her frustrations with the job market, her worries about making ends meet, her determination to find something that would provide stability for her family. Our exchanges settled into a pattern of maybe once a week, sometimes less. Always initiated by one of us with some pretext related to work or job searching, but gradually expanding to include more personal territory. She'd share a funny story about a disastrous interview, and I'd respond with my own tale of corporate bureaucracy run amok. I'd mention a particularly challenging day managing difficult guards, and she'd offer insights based on her own experience dealing with workplace personalities. Looking back, I can see how carefully we were both stepping around the growing connection between us. Every message had plausible professional justification. We weren't flirting, we weren't crossing any obvious lines. We were just two adults who'd worked together briefly maintaining a friendly professional relationship. But beneath that surface propriety, something else was building. I started looking forward to her messages in a way that had nothing to do with helping her find employment. When my phone would buzz with a text notification, I'd feel a little spike of disappointment if it wasn't from her. When she'd go more than a week without reaching out, I'd find myself wondering how she was doing, whether she'd found a job, whether everything was okay. The conversations were gradually getting more personal, though still within bounds that I could rationalize as appropriate. She told me about her decision to remain single, how she'd been focusing entirely on her teenagers for years and had almost forgotten how to relate to adults on a personal level. There was a loneliness in that admission that resonated with my own growing sense of isolation in my marriage. I found myself sharing more about my own life than I probably should have. Not specific complaints about my wife, but general observations about the challenges of long-term marriage, the way family responsibilities could sometimes feel overwhelming, the difficulty of maintaining your individual identity when you're always thinking about what everyone else needs. She was an incredibly good listener, responding to my occasional venting sessions with understanding rather than judgment. She didn't try to fix my problems or offer relationship advice, she just acknowledged that adult life was complicated and sometimes lonely even when you're surrounded by people who depend on you. Months passed this way. Occasional texts, always with some surface justification, gradually becoming more frequent and more personal. I learned about her struggles with her ex-husband, her pride in her children's achievements, her frustrations with being out of work for so long. She learned about my work challenges, my concerns about my kids, my growing sense that I was just going through the motions in most areas of my life. We were both lonely, though in different ways. She was literally alone, having chosen solitude to focus on parenting. I was surrounded by family but felt emotionally isolated, going through the choreographed dance of marriage without real intimacy or connection. Neither of us was looking for an affair. I don't think either of us would have consciously chosen to complicate our lives in such a destructive way. But we were two people slowly circling each other's emptiness, drawn together by a connection that felt increasingly rare and precious. The shift from professional to personal happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it until it was too late. By the time I realized we'd crossed some invisible line from appropriate to inappropriate, I was already emotionally invested in a way that made it hard to pull back. The breakthrough moment came during one of our longer text conversations in late September. We'd been discussing the challenges of single parenting versus married parenting, comparing notes on the different pressures and responsibilities. She mentioned feeling envious of couples who seemed to have figured out how to maintain their connection while raising children, and I admitted that most of the couples we knew, including my own marriage, were more about logistics and coordination than real partnership. For the first time, I'd explicitly acknowledged that my marriage wasn't working, at least not in any meaningful emotional sense. And for the first time, she'd admitted that her choice to remain single wasn't entirely voluntary, that she missed having an adult connection, someone to share the daily experiences and challenges with. We were both vulnerable in that conversation in a way we hadn't been before, acknowledging needs and disappointments that we'd been carrying alone. It felt like we were finally seeing each other clearly, not just as former co-workers maintaining a professional relationship, but as two people who'd found something genuine and valuable in each other's company. That night, I lay in bed next to my sleeping wife, staring at the ceiling and thinking about our conversation. I was playing with fire, and I knew it. But the connection felt so natural, so easy, so different from the careful negotiations that had become my primary form of communication at home. I told myself I could handle it. That I was mature enough, disciplined enough, committed enough to my marriage to maintain appropriate boundaries while still enjoying the rare pleasure of feeling understood by someone who seemed to genuinely appreciate who I was as a person. I was completely wrong. October in our region is beautiful but melancholy, the kind of weather that makes you nostalgic for things you can't quite name. The leaves were turning, the air was getting crisp, and I was driving home from another routine day at work when everything changed. I'd stopped at a red light about 3 blocks from my house, that familiar stretch of road I'd driven thousands of times over the years. My phone buzzed with a text notification, and I glanced down expecting to see a message from my wife about dinner plans or a reminder about one of the kids' activities. Instead, I saw her name on the screen, and below it, a message that made my heart stop. I have to tell you something. I think you're gorgeous. The light turned green, but I couldn't move. Cars were honking behind me, and I was just sitting there staring at 7 words that had just detonated my carefully constructed world. This was it, the moment of truth, the clear and unmistakable line between appropriate and inappropriate, between loyal and unfaithful, between the life I had and the life I suddenly wanted. I should have deleted the message. Should have driven home, kissed my wife, helped my kids with their homework, and pretended it never happened. Should have texted back something professional and distant, re-establishing boundaries that had obviously become too blurred. Instead, I pulled into a parking lot and typed back, "I find you attractive too." 7 words in response that felt like jumping off a cliff. What happened next was an avalanche of honesty that buried any pretense of maintaining professional boundaries. She told me she'd been fighting her attraction to me since the very first day, that she'd gone home after that routine drug test and found herself thinking about me in ways that shocked her, touching herself while imagining what it would be like to be with me, then feeling terrible guilt because she knew I was married. No woman had ever been so direct with me about desire. My wife, even in our early days, had been more reserved, more subtle in expressing attraction. This was raw, honest, overwhelming in its intensity. Here was this incredible woman telling me I'd been driving her crazy for months, that she'd been fighting herself out of respect for my marriage, but she couldn't keep pretending she didn't want me. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We texted for hours that night, sitting in separate houses, pouring out months of suppressed attraction and growing emotional connection. She painted vivid pictures of what she wanted to do to me, what she imagined when she thought about me alone at night. I found myself reciprocating with fantasies I'd never shared with anyone, describing desires I'd barely admitted to myself. It was the most intense sexual conversation of my life, and we hadn't even touched each other. Just words on screens, but they carried more electricity than most physical encounters I'd had. She made me feel desired in a way I'd forgotten was possible, like I was irresistible rather than just convenient. But even in the middle of this intoxicating rush, guilt was eating at me. I kept bringing up the obstacles, reminding her I was married, pointing out all the reasons why this couldn't continue. Part of me hoped she'd be the responsible one, that she'd pull back and save both of us from the inevitable disaster. Instead, she pushed harder. She told me she didn't care about the complications, that what we had was worth any risk. She said she'd been single by choice for years because no man had made her feel the way I did, that she'd rather have something real and complicated than safe and empty. The next few days were a blur of constant communication. We texted during work breaks, late at night when everyone else was asleep, first thing in the morning before the day's responsibilities kicked in. The conversations were intensely sexual but also deeply emotional. We were sharing fantasies and fears, desires and disappointments, creating an intimacy that felt more real than anything I'd experienced in years. She began opening up about her past relationships, why she'd chosen to remain single for so long. She'd been hurt badly in her marriage, betrayed in ways that made it hard for her to trust anyone completely. But she said I felt different, safe in a way that made her want to risk vulnerability again. I shared things about my marriage that I'd never said out loud to anyone. Not cruel criticisms of my wife, but honest acknowledgments about how we'd grown apart, how we'd stopped seeing each other as individuals and started treating each other as roles in a shared production. I told her about the loneliness of being married to someone who knew all your habits but none of your dreams. She listened without judgment, offered understanding rather than advice. She didn't try to convince me to leave my wife or make promises about our future together. She just acknowledged that life was complicated, that sometimes you found connection in unexpected places, that the heart didn't always follow the rules society expected. The sexual tension was building to a breaking point. We started making vague references to meeting in person, to taking this beyond text messages and phone calls. She even gave me her address, a gesture of trust and invitation that left me reeling. Here was this woman who'd been careful about trusting people, offering me the most intimate access to her life. I found myself driving past her neighborhood on my way home from work, not stopping but just knowing she was there, imagining what it would be like to knock on her door and finally touch the person who'd been consuming my thoughts for weeks. The double life was exhausting and exhilarating. I'd sit at family dinners texting her under the table, more engaged with the woman in my phone than the people across from me. I'd lie in bed next to my wife composing messages to my secret obsession, feeling more alive than I had in years while simultaneously hating myself for the betrayal. 2 weeks. That's how long the emotional affair lasted before I reached my breaking point. 2 weeks of the most intense connection I'd ever experienced, combined with the most profound guilt I'd ever carried. 2 weeks of incredible highs followed by crushing lows, of feeling like I'd found my soulmate while destroying my soul in the process. The end came during what should have been a routine family moment. We were having dinner together, something we still managed to do most nights despite our emotional distance, and my wife was telling a story about her day at work. My kids were contributing their own news about school and friends, and I was sitting there with my hand on my phone, more interested in the woman who might be texting me than the people who depended on me for everything. That's when it hit me. I was choosing a fantasy over my real life. These people around the table weren't perfect, and neither was I, but they were real. They were here, they were mine, they deserved better than a husband and father who was emotionally checked out because he was living in his phone. The person I was becoming terrified me. I'd always prided myself on being honorable, on having integrity, on being someone others could count on. But here I was living a lie, keeping secrets, betraying the trust of the woman who'd stood by me for 10 years, and preparing to betray it even more completely. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping wife, I realized I had two choices: confess everything and try to save my marriage, or leave everything and pursue this new relationship that had taken over my life. There was no middle ground. The emotional affair had reached the point where it was about to become physical. We'd started making specific plans to meet, and I knew that once we crossed that line, there would be no going back. I had to choose between the life I had and the life I wanted. Between responsibility and passion. Between the woman who'd shared 10 years of my life and the woman who'd made me feel alive again in 2 weeks. I chose my marriage. Not because it was easier, it was actually much harder. Not because I didn't love her, I did, in a way that scared me with its intensity. I chose my marriage because it was built on 10 years of shared history, because my wife deserved honesty, and because I needed to find out if we could recapture what we'd lost. But first, I had to confess everything. And that conversation was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done. I chose Saturday morning for the conversation that would either save or destroy my marriage. The kids were at their respective activities, soccer practice and a sleepover, giving us several hours of uninterrupted time to deal with whatever came next. My wife was in the kitchen making her weekend pancakes, humming along to a song on the radio, looking more relaxed than she had in months. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. She looked so peaceful, so unsuspecting of the bomb I was about to drop on our life together. It would have been easy to walk away, to continue living the lie, to let the affair run its course without ever involving her in the mess I'd created. But I knew that was impossible. The guilt was eating me alive, and more importantly, I'd reached the point where I was going to have to choose between my marriage and my obsession. If there was any chance of saving what my wife and I had built together, it required complete honesty about what I'd almost thrown away. The words came out in a rush once I started talking. I told her about the emotional affair, about the months of increasingly personal texting, about the attraction that had spiraled out of control. I explained how it had started as innocent professional communication and evolved into the most intense connection I'd ever experienced with another person. I watched her face cycle through shock, hurt, anger, and something that might have been relief. She didn't scream or throw things or demand that I pack my bags immediately. Instead, she set down her coffee cup, looked me directly in the eyes, and said something that broke my heart: "I've felt you pulling away for months. At least now I know why." The conversation that followed lasted most of the day. We talked about things we should have discussed years ago: how our marriage had become routine, how we'd stopped seeing each other as lovers and started treating each other like convenient roommates managing a shared household. We discussed the polyamory experiment from 2 years earlier and how her disappointing experiences had made her withdraw even further from physical and emotional intimacy. She admitted that she'd been feeling like a failure as a wife, sensing my distance but not knowing how to bridge the gap. She'd thrown herself into managing the household and the kids' activities, convincing herself that if she could just be efficient enough, organized enough, helpful enough, maybe I'd start paying attention to her again. I realized that while I'd been starving for connection and appreciation, she'd been starving for the same things. We'd both been so focused on what we weren't getting from each other that we'd stopped giving anything meaningful in return. We'd become two people drowning in the same pool, too focused on our own struggle to help each other stay afloat. The hardest part was explaining the intensity of what I'd felt for the other woman. My wife needed to understand that this wasn't just a casual flirtation or a moment of weakness, it was a connection that had made me question everything about my life and my choices. She deserved to know how close I'd come to walking away from our marriage, how real the alternative had felt. But I also had to help her understand that my choice to confess and end the affair wasn't about settling for second best. It was about recognizing that we'd both been so busy managing the logistics of marriage that we'd forgotten to nurture the love that brought us together in the first place. She cried, and I cried, and we held each other for the first time in months without it feeling like an obligation. We were both mourning, her for the betrayal and the months of feeling disconnected from her own husband, me for the loss of the most intense romantic connection I'd ever experienced and for the pain I'd caused the person who deserved it least. By evening, we'd made some tentative agreements about moving forward. We would continue marriage counseling, but with a focus on rebuilding intimacy rather than just managing conflict. We would both commit to being more intentional about nurturing our connection, treating each other as lovers rather than just co-parents and household managers. And I would end all contact with the other woman immediately and completely. That last commitment was the one that scared me most, because I knew how hard it was going to be. Ending things with her was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. She didn't take the news well, which I completely understood. From her perspective, I'd pursued her for months, made her believe we had something real and worth the risk, then abandoned her the moment things got complicated. The conversation happened over the phone. I couldn't face doing it through text, but I also couldn't trust myself to end things cleanly if we met in person. I explained that I'd confessed everything to my wife and that we were going to try to work things out. I told her that our connection had been real and intense and meaningful, but that I couldn't continue living a double life. She was hurt, angry, and felt betrayed, all completely justified emotions. She accused me of using her, of treating her like a disposable fantasy while protecting my real life. She said I'd awakened feelings in her that had been dormant for years, made her believe in the possibility of love again, then ripped it away when reality intruded. I couldn't argue with any of that. I had pursued her, I had made her feel special and desired, and I was abandoning her to work on a marriage that I'd been complaining about for months. From her perspective, I was choosing convenience over passion, obligation over love. But I also couldn't make her understand that my choice wasn't about picking the easier option. Staying married and trying to rebuild what we'd lost was actually much harder than running away with her would have been. It required facing my failures as a husband, acknowledging the ways I'd checked out of my marriage long before she came along, and doing the difficult work of learning to love someone I'd taken for granted for years. The aftermath got messy in ways I should have expected. She dealt with her pain and anger by creating a narrative where she was the one who'd ultimately rejected me. She made a Facebook post about our relationship that painted me as someone who'd pursued her relentlessly, then been devastated when she chose to step back to protect my marriage. It was a face-saving fiction that allowed her to maintain some dignity in a situation where she'd been genuinely hurt. I understood the need for that story, even though it stung to be painted as the pathetic rejected suitor when the reality was more complicated. But privately, I had to admit there was something oddly liberating about being on the receiving end of rejection, even manufactured rejection. In all my previous relationships, I'd always been the one left behind, the one trying to hold on to something the other person was ready to abandon. For once, I was supposedly the one who'd been deemed unworthy, and there was a strange freedom in that narrative. More importantly, Ending the affair forced me to confront what I'd really lost. It wasn't just the sexual excitement or the thrill of new romance, it was the feeling of being truly seen and appreciated by someone who chose to be with me rather than someone who was stuck with me through legal and social obligations. That realization helped me understand what I needed to bring back to my marriage. My wife deserved to feel chosen, not just settled for. She deserved to be courted and appreciated and desired, not just efficiently managed as part of our household operations. The depression hit about a week after ending things with her. It wasn't just sadness about losing her, though that was certainly part of it, but a crushing awareness of who I'd become during those 2 weeks and what that said about the state of my marriage and my character. I'd betrayed my wife's trust in the most fundamental way possible. I'd used another person's genuine feelings for my own gratification, then discarded her when she became inconvenient. I'd been prepared to abandon my children and destroy their family stability for what amounted to a 2-week fantasy. The person I'd been during the affair was someone I didn't recognize or respect. But even deeper than the guilt was a profound sense of loss. I'd tasted something during those 2 weeks that I hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being passionately desired, of being someone's priority rather than just another responsibility on their list. Giving that up felt like voluntarily returning to prison after a brief taste of freedom. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in infidelity recovery. The sessions were uncomfortable in the way that effective therapy always is, forcing me to examine not just what I'd done but why I'd been vulnerable to temptation in the first place. What needs had my marriage been failing to meet? What vulnerabilities had made me susceptible to the affair? How had I justified the betrayal to myself in real time? The hardest realization was that I'd been emotionally checked out of my marriage long before she came along. She wasn't the cause of my marital problems, she was the symptom. I'd been so focused on what I wasn't getting from my wife that I'd stopped giving anything meaningful myself. I'd become a passive participant in my own life, going through the motions while secretly resenting that the motions weren't more fulfilling. Dr. Martinez, my therapist, had this way of asking questions that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths. When I complained about feeling unappreciated at home, she asked what I'd done lately to show appreciation for my wife. When I talked about missing passion in my marriage, she wondered when I'd last tried to create passionate moments rather than just waiting for them to happen spontaneously. The sessions revealed patterns I'd been blind to for years. I'd developed what she called emotional outsourcing, looking for other people to meet needs that I should have been working to fulfill within my marriage. Instead of addressing problems directly with my wife, I'd been seeking validation and connection elsewhere, creating a cycle where my marriage got less of my energy while I complained that it wasn't giving me enough in return. The individual therapy was helpful, but the real breakthrough came when my wife and I started seeing Dr. Martinez together. Having a neutral third party guide our conversations made it possible to discuss things we'd been avoiding for years. We talked about how we'd both been carrying resentments, how we'd both felt unappreciated and taken for granted, how we'd both been going through the motions of marriage without investing in its emotional health. My wife admitted that she'd sensed my distance long before the affair but hadn't known how to address it. She'd thrown herself into managing household logistics, convincing herself that if she could just be more efficient, more organized, more helpful with practical matters, maybe I'd start paying attention to her again. She'd been trying to earn my love through competence rather than demanding it through connection. We both realized we'd been living like efficient roommates rather than passionate partners. We'd mastered the logistics of marriage, coordinating schedules, managing finances, raising children, but we'd forgotten how to be lovers, how to prioritize each other's emotional and physical needs, how to create space for intimacy in our busy lives. The recovery process was slow and often frustrating. Some days I felt confident that we could rebuild something stronger than what we'd had before. Other days I questioned whether we were just going through the motions, whether the damage was too extensive to repair, whether we were trying to resurrect something that had died years ago. But gradually, small changes began to accumulate into something more substantial. I started giving my wife the attention and energy I'd been pouring into my phone during the affair. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. I remembered why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place, the qualities that had made me want to build a life with her. I began courting her again, bringing flowers for no reason, planning date nights that didn't involve Netflix and takeout, asking about her thoughts and dreams rather than just her schedule for the next day. I started treating her like someone I was trying to win over rather than someone I'd already captured. She responded cautiously at first, understandably wary of this sudden shift in attention. But gradually, she began to open up again. We started having real conversations instead of just logistics about responsibilities and schedules. We talked about our dreams, our fears, the people we wanted to become, the experiences we wanted to share. The physical intimacy took longer to rebuild. Trust had been damaged, and we both had to work through the awkwardness of rediscovering each other's bodies after years of routine, mechanical encounters. But when we finally made love with genuine passion and presence, it felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. Through mutual connections in the security industry, I occasionally heard updates about how she was handling the aftermath of our relationship. The reports weren't encouraging. She'd struggled to find steady work, partly due to the job market but also because she seemed to be sabotaging opportunities when they arose. Friends who knew us both mentioned that she'd been drinking more heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain of rejection and the return to loneliness. She'd also started collecting rescue animals, dogs, cats, even a few exotic birds, filling her house with creatures that needed her but couldn't hurt her the way humans could. The pattern was heartbreakingly familiar. She'd opened herself up to love for the first time in years, allowed herself to be vulnerable with someone she thought she could trust, then been abandoned when the relationship became inconvenient. It confirmed every fear she'd had about letting people get close, every reason she'd given herself for staying single and self-sufficient. Part of me felt responsible for her pain. I'd awakened something in her that had been dormant for years, made her believe in the possibility of connection again, then ripped it away when reality intruded. She'd trusted me enough to share her address, to be vulnerable about her desires, to imagine a future where she didn't have to choose between protecting her heart and opening it to love. But I also recognized that I couldn't save her from her own patterns of self-destruction. Her struggles with loneliness and trust had started long before our relationship and would require her own work to resolve. I'd been a catalyst, not a cure, and trying to maintain contact would only make things harder for both of us. The hardest part was knowing that she was probably right about me in some ways. I had used her, even if that hadn't been my conscious intention. I had treated her like a fantasy that could be discarded when it conflicted with my real life. I had awakened feelings in her that I wasn't prepared to honor with genuine commitment. But I also knew that leaving my marriage for her wouldn't have solved either of our problems. We would have been starting a relationship built on betrayal and secrecy, carrying the guilt of destroyed families and broken trust. The intensity that had felt so exciting in secret would have been poisoned by the reality of what we'd done to achieve it. Still, I worried about her. The woman who'd made me feel more alive than I had in years was apparently destroying herself with alcohol and isolation. The person who'd shown me what passion could feel like was choosing numbness over the risk of connection. It was a waste of someone who had so much to offer the world, if she could just learn to trust again. Sometimes I wondered if I should reach out, try to help her find healthier ways to cope with the pain. But every time I considered it, I realized that any contact from me would likely make things worse. I was the person who'd hurt her most recently and most deeply. My attempts at comfort would probably feel like salt in an open wound. The best thing I could do for her was to stay away and hope that someday she'd find someone who could appreciate her intensity without being frightened by it, someone who could handle her passion without betraying it when things got complicated. 6 months after the affair ended, I could finally see it clearly for what it had been, not a great love story derailed by circumstances, but a wake-up call delivered in the most painful way possible. It had shown me how far my marriage had drifted, how much I'd been taking my wife for granted, and how easy it is to rationalize betrayal when you're emotionally starved. The 2 weeks of emotional intensity had taught me what I'd been missing, not just the excitement of new attraction, but the feeling of being truly seen and desired by someone who chose to focus on me. That hunger for connection wasn't wrong, but I'd been looking for it in the wrong place. Instead of working to rebuild intimacy with my wife, I'd sought it with someone else. I learned that emotional affairs can be just as devastating as physical ones, sometimes more so. The betrayal isn't just about sex, it's about emotional energy, about sharing intimacy that belongs to your partner with someone else. Those late-night texts weren't just words on a screen, they were pieces of my heart that I was giving away instead of offering to my wife. The affair had also revealed the extent to which I'd been living passively, waiting for my life to become fulfilling rather than actively working to create the experiences I wanted. I'd been expecting my wife to make me feel desired and appreciated without putting equivalent effort into making her feel the same way. I'd been hoping for passion to spontaneously reignite without creating the conditions that allow passion to flourish. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that long-term relationships require the same kind of intentional effort that people put into new relationships, but applied differently. Instead of trying to impress someone with your best self, you have to continue growing and evolving so that your best self keeps expanding. Instead of wondering if someone is compatible with you, you have to keep working to be compatible with who they're becoming. The affair had given me a glimpse of what it felt like to be fully present with someone, to be genuinely curious about their thoughts and experiences, to feel excited about sharing your own inner world with another person. But I'd been wrong to think that level of connection was only possible with someone new. It was possible with my wife, I'd just forgotten how to create it. I started paying attention to the small moments that I'd been missing for years. The way my wife's face lit up when she talked about a book she was reading, the pride in her voice when she described one of our children's achievements, the way she moved through the house in the morning, efficient but graceful, managing a dozen tasks while I was still trying to figure out where I'd left my keys. She was still the person I'd fallen in love with, but she'd grown and changed in ways I hadn't been noticing. She'd developed new interests, new strengths, new perspectives on life. I'd been so focused on what seemed missing from our relationship that I'd stopped being curious about who she was becoming. The affair had also taught me about the difference between fantasy and reality. The intensity I'd felt with the other woman was real, but it was also unsustainable. It was based on novelty, secrecy, and the absence of daily responsibilities and conflicts. We'd never had to negotiate whose turn it was to clean the bathroom or stay up with a sick child. We'd never had to figure out how to maintain passion while dealing with mortgage payments and aging parents and the thousand small stresses of actual partnership. My marriage, for all its flaws, was built on a foundation of shared experience and mutual support that couldn't be replicated in a 2-week emotional affair. My wife had been with me through job losses and family crises, through the sleep deprivation of early parenthood and the challenges of raising teenagers. She'd seen me at my worst and chosen to stay. That history had value that I'd been too blind to appreciate. Rebuilding trust after an affair is like physical therapy after a serious injury. It's painful, slow, and requires consistent effort even when you don't feel like you're making progress. There were days when both my wife and I questioned whether we were working towards something better or just prolonging the inevitable end of our marriage. The first few months were the hardest. Every conversation felt loaded with the potential for conflict. My wife would ask innocent questions about my day, and I'd wonder if she was checking up on me. I'd see her looking at her phone and feel a spike of paranoia about whether she was talking to someone else, whether she'd decided to explore her own alternatives to our damaged marriage. We had to relearn how to communicate about basic things. I'd lost the right to casual privacy. She needed to know where I was, who I was with, what I was doing, not because she wanted to control me but because she needed to rebuild trust gradually. I had to accept that the consequences of my betrayal included giving up certain freedoms until I'd earned back the right to be trusted. The hardest part was dealing with the random waves of grief and anger that would hit both of us without warning. She'd be fine for days, then suddenly break down crying because something reminded her of the affair. I'd be making progress in therapy, then feel overwhelmed by loss for what I'd given up with the other woman. We both had to learn that healing isn't linear, that setbacks don't mean failure, that recovery takes longer than anyone wants it to. But slowly, we began to build something new. Not just repairing what had been broken, but creating something stronger than what we'd had before. We started dating each other again, planning activities that had nothing to do with household management or parenting responsibilities. We took weekend trips to places we'd never been, trying to create new shared experiences that weren't tainted by the years of emotional distance. I learned to court my wife the way I'd courted the other woman, but with the advantage of knowing her history, her preferences, her dreams. I started bringing her flowers, but not just any flowers, the specific type she'd mentioned loving years ago. I planned dates around her interests, not just activities I thought she should enjoy. I listened to her with the same attention I'd given to my affair partner, asking follow-up questions, remembering details from previous conversations. She began to respond with cautious optimism, then genuine enthusiasm as she realized I was serious about rebuilding our connection. She started sharing more about her inner life, her thoughts about work and friendships and the books she was reading. She began initiating physical contact again, small touches that gradually built into more substantial intimacy. The sexual reconnection was particularly challenging. We'd both been hurt, she by my betrayal, me by the loss of the most intense attraction I'd ever experienced. We had to rediscover each other's bodies and desires, learning to be present with each other instead of going through familiar motions or thinking about other people. But when we finally made love with genuine passion and presence, it felt like a revelation. This was what we'd been missing, not just physical pleasure, but the emotional connection that made physical intimacy meaningful. We were choosing each other, not just accepting each other. We were creating passion rather than waiting for it to happen. The marriage counseling sessions became less about managing conflict and more about deepening our understanding of each other. We explored the dreams we'd had when we first got married, the ways we'd grown and changed over the years, the future we wanted to build together. We talked about what we'd learned from the affair, how it had revealed both our vulnerabilities and our capacity for growth. Dr. Martinez helped us understand that the affair had been a symptom of deeper issues, but it had also created an opportunity for transformation. We'd been forced to examine our marriage honestly, to acknowledge what wasn't working, and to commit to doing better. Most couples let their relationships drift into complacency without ever addressing the underlying problems. We'd been given a painful but valuable chance to rebuild from a foundation of honesty and intentionality. As I worked through the aftermath of the affair, I began to see it in the context of larger patterns in my life and in modern marriage generally. I'd been living reactively, responding to dissatisfaction by seeking escape rather than addressing problems directly. I'd been expecting my marriage to fulfill me without taking responsibility for making it fulfilling. The affair had been seductive partly because it seemed to offer a solution to my problems without requiring me to do the hard work of addressing them. Instead of figuring out how to rebuild intimacy with my wife, I'd found someone who made me feel instantly connected. Instead of working through the challenges of long-term partnership, I'd found someone who didn't know my flaws and limitations. But that was also why the affair was ultimately hollow. It was built on fantasy rather than reality, on the excitement of the unknown rather than the satisfaction of deep understanding. The other woman had been attracted to an idealized version of me, the person I was during our brief interactions rather than the person I was during ordinary moments of stress and fatigue and everyday responsibility. My wife, by contrast, knew exactly who I was, my strengths and weaknesses, my good days and bad days, my capacity for kindness and my tendency towards selfishness. She'd chosen to love me anyway, to build a life with me despite my imperfections. That kind of love couldn't be replicated in a 2-week emotional affair, no matter how intense the connection felt. The affair had also revealed how much I'd been taking for granted. I'd been focused on what my marriage wasn't giving me rather than appreciating what it was providing. My wife had been my partner through every major challenge and celebration of the past 10 years. She'd supported my career, raised our children, managed our household, and somehow still found energy to be kind and thoughtful in ways I'd stopped noticing. I'd been living like someone who complains about a house while ignoring its solid foundation, focusing on cosmetic flaws while forgetting the essential structure that made everything else possible. The affair had shown me how much I'd lose if I threw away what we'd built together, how much I'd been undervaluing the stability and partnership that had become invisible to me. But the affair had also shown me what was possible when I brought my full attention and energy to a relationship. The intensity I'd felt with the other woman wasn't just about her, it was about me being fully present, fully engaged, fully appreciative of connection with another person. I could bring that same energy to my marriage if I chose to, and the results would be even more meaningful because they'd be built on a foundation of shared history and mutual commitment. The experience taught me that passion isn't something that happens to you, it's something you create through attention, intention, and effort. I'd been waiting for my marriage to become exciting again rather than working to make it exciting. I'd been expecting my wife to make me feel desired rather than focusing on making her feel desired. When I shifted my focus from what I wasn't getting to what I could give, everything began to change. When I started treating my wife like someone I was trying to win over rather than someone I'd already captured, she responded with enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place. A year after the affair ended, my marriage isn't perfect, but it's alive in a way it hasn't been for years. We still have disagreements, still get frustrated with each other, still have days when we're more like efficient roommates than passionate lovers. But we also have something we'd lost, the sense that we're choosing each other, that we're building something together, that our relationship is worth investing in. The affair taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. It's something you do every day through small choices and conscious attention. It's choosing to be curious about your partner rather than assuming you know everything about them. It's choosing to express appreciation rather than taking their contributions for granted. It's choosing to create moments of connection rather than waiting for them to happen spontaneously. I think about the other woman sometimes, but with less frequency and intensity as time passes. I hope she's found her way to healing, that she's learned to trust again, that she's discovered she doesn't have to choose between protecting her heart and opening it to love. She deserves to find someone who can appreciate her intensity without being frightened by it, someone who can handle her passion without betraying it when things get complicated. The affair was the most intense connection I'd ever experienced, but it was also the most destructive thing I'd ever done to myself and others. It taught me what I was capable of, both the heights of passion and the depths of betrayal. It showed me how much I had to lose and how much I had to gain, depending on the choices I made. I'm grateful for the wake-up call, painful as it was. Sometimes you have to nearly lose everything to remember why it mattered in the first place. Sometimes you have to experience the full intensity of what you're missing to understand what you need to create in your own life. My wife and I are still writing our story together, one day at a time, with honesty and intention we'd forgotten how to bring to our relationship. We're not the same people we were when we got married, and we're not the same people we were before the affair. We're something new, two people who chose to grow together rather than apart, who decided to build something better from the ruins of what had been broken. The story isn't over. It may never be over, as long as we keep choosing each other, keep working to see each other clearly, keep creating the kind of connection that makes both of us feel fully alive and deeply loved. And maybe that's the real lesson, that love isn't something that just happens to you, but something you choose to create and recreate, day after day, with the person standing right beside you, through all the ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges that make up a life shared with another human being. The affair lasted 2 weeks. The recovery took months. The rebuilding will take years. But I'm grateful for all of it, the pain and the healing, the destruction and the creation, the ending and the beginning that taught me what it really means to love someone completely and consciously, with all the messy, difficult, beautiful complexity that real love requires.